Money makes people stupid. $100 million makes them suicidal. Damien sat in a room full of bleeding-edge engineers who were one wrong wire, snip away from acidic death, all for a payday they'd never live to spend. Then a girl in a cheap cotton uniform stepped over the broken glass, bypassed the men with PhDs, and solved the impossible puzzle before the ice in his scotch even melted. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a hostage situation. Silence suffocated the penthouse. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of an empty room, but the tense electric stillness of an execution awaiting the drop. Damien Mercer leaned back in a leather armchair that cost more than most people earned in a decade. He didn't look like a man who controlled half the shipping lanes on the eastern seaboard. He looked exhausted. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up to reveal skin mapped with faded ink, and his dark eyes were fixed on the center of the massive mahogany conference table. Sitting there was a cylinder. It was a brutalist piece of engineering. Solid titanium ringed with 9 interlocking dials, each etched with a chaotic mix of alphanumeric characters and Cyrillic script. It looked like a pipe bomb designed by a madman. In reality, it was a physical crypto vault. Inside rested a single flash memory drive containing the seed phrases to a decentralized wallet holding precisely $100 million. There was a catch. The cylinder was rigged. A glass vial of hydrofluoric acid was suspended inside the mechanism. 2 incorrect combinations, or any attempt to force the casing open with drills or saws, would shatter the glass. The drive would dissolve into useless plastic sludge in seconds. 3 of the city's highest-paid safecrackers and reverse engineers stood around the table, sweating through their bespoke suits. They had been working for 6 hours. The air smelled of burnt coffee and fear. "Well?" Damien asked. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of anger, which only made it more terrifying. The lead engineer, a man named Aries, who charged $1,000 an hour just to answer the phone, wiped his forehead with a trembling hand. "Mr. Mercer, the internal baffling it's unparalleled. It's not just mechanical. There's a magnetic locking system tied to the rotation. If we don't align the polarity exactly with the dial sequence the acid deploys. I don't pay you to describe the lock, Aris," Damien said, taking a slow sip of his scotch. The ice clinked against the crystal. "I pay you to open it. We need more time. You have 10 minutes. In the corner of the room, entirely ignored by the powerful men sweating over their impending failure, Caitlin Scott wrung out a damp microfiber cloth. She wasn't supposed to be here. Her mother, the head housekeeper for the Mercer estate, was down with a brutal chest infection. Caitlin entirely broke, and staring down the barrel of a looming eviction notice, had taken her mother's security badge and shift. "Keep your head down," her mother had rasped that morning. "Do not look them in the eye. You are furniture." Caitlin was good at being furniture. She had spent her entire 22 years blending into the background, observing the mechanics of the world while remaining largely invisible to the people running it. But her eyes kept drifting to the cylinder on the table. She wiped down the edge of a mahogany bookshelf, her rough, calloused hands moving in practiced, rhythmic circles. Caitlin didn't know much about offshore bank accounts or decentralized finance, but she knew machinery. Her late father had been a clockmaker, a man who spoke in gears, springs, and tension ratios. Before he drank himself to death, he had taught Caitlin how to listen to metal. She watched Aris attach a stethoscope to the side of the titanium casing. He was turning the 3rd dial, his face pale. "He's doing it wrong," Caitlin thought her rag, pausing on the wood. The mechanism was a variation of a Russian combination padlock, an antiquated design updated with modern materials. Aris was listening for the drop of a pin, but titanium didn't resonate like brass. The sound would be trapped by the magnetic field he had just complained about. He needed to feel the resistance, not listen for the click. "Sir, if we rush this..." Iris pleaded, pulling the stethoscope from his ears. "The acid is going to melt my money." Damien finished. He stood up. The air in the room seemed to compress. He walked slowly to the table, towering over the engineers. "My father left me this puzzle before his heart gave out. It was his final joke. $100 million in liquid capital locked inside a toy just to prove I wasn't smart enough to get it. And you three are proving him right. We are doing everything humanly possible." Iris stammered. Caitlin moved to the side table to collect the empty espresso cups. She kept her chin tucked, her dark hair falling forward to shield her face. She reached for a cup near Iris's elbow, just as the engineer threw his hands up in frustration. His arm clipped her shoulder. The porcelain cup slipped from Caitlin's grip. It hit the hardwood floor, shattering with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot in the tense silence. Every head snapped toward her. Caitlin froze. The blood drained from her face. She looked down at the jagged white shards scattered across the expensive Persian rug. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She dropped to her knees, immediately gathering the sharp pieces, ignoring the sting as a sliver sliced into her thumb. Damien stared at her. His expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened. He looked from the trembling maid on the floor to the trembling engineers at the table. Disgust washed over him. He was surrounded by incompetence. "Get out," Damien said softly. Iris blinked. "Mr. Mercer, please just give us..." "Ledger," Damien said, not raising his voice. From the shadows near the double doors, Ledger Howard stepped forward. Ledger was Damien's underboss, a man built like a freight train, with a face that looked like it had caught a few too many actual trains. "You heard the boss," Ledger growled, resting a hand on the inside of his suit jacket. "Pack your toys. Walk." The engineers scrambled. They shoved their tools into aluminum cases, practically tripping over each other in their haste to escape the penthouse. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them, leaving a suffocating void in their wake. Caitlin remained on the floor, perfectly still, holding the broken porcelain against her chest. She prayed they would forget she was there. Damien stared at the titanium cylinder. He pressed his palms against the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "Well," Ledger said from the doorway, "that was a waste of 50 grand in retainer fees." Damien let out a harsh, humorless laugh. He picked up his scotch glass and downed the amber liquid in one burning swallow. "The old man is laughing at me from hell, Ledger. I can hear him. He built an empire on blood and extortion and hid the retirement fund in a parlor trick. We can find someone else. Someone from Europe. There's a guy in Berlin." "No!" Damien snapped, his voice finally cracking with genuine anger. He slammed the glass down. It didn't break, but the heavy thud made Caitlin flinch. "I'm done flying in frauds who read blueprints. The mechanism is custom. There is no blueprint." He dragged a hand through his dark hair, pacing the length of the room. He walked right past Caitlin, not even registering her existence as she swept the last of the dust into her hand. "It's a joke," Damien muttered, his cynicism bleeding out into the room. He gestured wildly at the cylinder. "Look at it, it's right there. $100 million. Enough to buy politicians, buy armies, buy peace. And it's sitting there." He stopped, leaning heavily against the back of his chair. He looked at the ceiling, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "Fix this and I'll give you $100 million. Damien mocked, speaking to the empty air, mimicking his dead father's gravelly voice. He let out a dark chuckle. "I'd give the whole damn vault to anyone in this godforsaken city who could open it right now, just to spite the old man." The silence returned heavy and oppressive. Caitlin looked at the cylinder. She looked at the intricate dials. She knew the pattern. She had seen the way the inner rings caught when Aris forced them. It wasn't a standard sequence. It was a Fibonacci spiral mapped to the Cyrillic alphabet. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. "You are furniture. Do not speak." Caitlin swallowed hard. Her eviction notice was taped to her refrigerator at home. Her mother's medical bills were piled on the kitchen counter, written in bright red ink. $100 million was an abstract concept. It didn't mean yachts or private jets to Caitlin. It meant breathing. It meant sleeping through the night without the crushing weight of panic sitting on her chest. She stood up. She placed the broken porcelain carefully onto a silver tray. She wiped her bleeding thumb on her cheap cotton apron. "Do you mean that—" The words left her mouth before her survival instincts could stop them. The room froze. Ledger Howard's hand instantly went to his jacket, his eyes snapping to the corner of the room. Damien stopped pacing. He turned slowly, his dark eyes locking onto Caitlin as if seeing her for the very first time. "What did you say?" Damien asked. His voice was a whisper, but it felt dangerously loud. Caitlin's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her palms were slick with sweat. She stepped away from the wall, her cheap sneakers squeaking slightly on the hardwood. "You said you'd give the money to anyone who could open it," Caitlin said. Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "Did you mean it?" Ledger let out a bark of laughter. "Boss want me to throw the help out." Damien didn't look away from Caitlin. He studied her, the faded uniform, the exhausted shadows under her eyes, the tiny smear of blood on her apron. He saw a desperate, insignificant girl, but he also saw something else. He saw an absolute lack of deference. "Who are you?" Damien asked. "Caitlin," she said. "I'm filling in for Maria. A maid," Damien said slowly, tasting the word. The absurdity of it hit him, and a cold, cynical smile touched his face. A maid is going to open a vault that defeated 3 master engineers. They were relying on acoustics. Caitlin said, her tone flattening out, slipping into the clinical detachment she used to explain clockwork to her father. Titanium deadens sound, and the magnetic lock they were whining about, it's a red herring. It's designed to push the pins out of alignment if you use metal tools. You don't use tools on this. You use torque. Damien's smile vanished. The cynical amusement died in his eyes, replaced by a sharp, calculating intensity. Ledger shifted uncomfortably. "Damien, she's out of her mind. Let me get her out of here." "No," Damien said. He walked slowly back to the table, his eyes never leaving Caitlin. He gestured to the cylinder. "You think you can open it?" "I know I can," Caitlin said. It wasn't arrogance. It was a simple statement of fact. Damien stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. The sheer audacity of it appealed to his dark sense of humor. If she failed, the acid deployed, the money burned, and his father's final joke was over. He was exactly where he started. But if she succeeded, if you fail, Damien said, his voice dropping to a lethal register. The acid destroys the drive. You destroy my $100 million. If I fail, you lose money you didn't have 5 minutes ago. Caitlin counted, her chin lifting slightly. But if I open it, I want the money. Ledger took a step forward, his face flushing red. "You little..." Damien held up a hand, silencing his underboss. He looked at Caitlin, really looked at her. She was terrified. He could see a slight tremor in her hands, but her eyes were dead set. "You wouldn't know what to do with $100 million, Caitlin," Damien said softly. "That's my problem," she replied. Damien slowly backed away from the table, leaving a clear path to the cylinder. He crossed his arms over his chest. "Be my guest," he said. Caitlin walked toward the table. Her legs felt like lead. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, run out the service elevator, and never look back. She was walking into a cage with a predator. Damien Mercer wasn't a businessman. He was a cartel masquerading as a corporation. She stopped at the edge of the mahogany table. The cylinder sat heavily on the polished wood, gleaming under the modern chandelier. Up close, it was beautiful in a brutal industrial way. No tools. Caitlin muttered to herself, wiping her hands on her apron one last time to ensure they were completely dry. What was that? Ledger snapped. Quiet, Ledger. Damien commanded, his eyes locked on Caitlin's hands. Caitlin placed her palms flat against the cold titanium. She closed her eyes. She didn't look at the letters or the numbers. Visuals were a distraction. A lock this complex was designed to overwhelm the eyes and the ears. You had to rely on touch. She took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of ozone and old scotch. She gripped the first two dials. Instead of turning them smoothly, she applied opposing pressure, twisting the first dial clockwise and the second counterclockwise, pushing them against each other until she felt a microscopic catch in the metal. There. It wasn't a click. It was a change in tension. You're not looking at the symbols. Damien noted his voice, a low hum in the quiet one. The symbols are arbitrary. Caitlin said, her eyes still closed, her focus absolute. The person who built this didn't care about passwords. They cared about the physical mechanics of the rings. It's a tension puzzle. She moved to the third and fourth dials. She twisted, held the torque, and waited. The metal warmed slightly beneath her skin. She felt the heavy, sluggish resistance of the magnetic field Iris had complained about. Don't fight the magnet. Her father's voice echoed in the back of her mind. Let it pull you into the groove. Caitlin relaxed her grip, letting the magnetic field pull the fourth dial a fraction of an inch to the left. She felt a solid, heavy thunk vibrate through her fingertips. 2 pins down, 7 to go. Sweat beaded on her forehead. The room was deathly quiet. She could hear the heavy, measured breathing of the 2 men watching her. She could feel the crushing weight of their stares. She worked faster now, finding the rhythm. Dials 5 and 6 yielded to a double twist maneuver she used to use on antique German lockboxes. Dials 7 and 8 required her to press inward while twisting, bypassing a false gate that would have snapped the acid vial instantly. She reached the final dial. She paused. Her hands were shaking badly now. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind cold, hard terror. If she was wrong about this last pin, the vial would break. She wouldn't just lose the money. Damien Mercer would likely kill her for destroying his inheritance. What's wrong? Damien asked. He stepped closer. She could feel the heat radiating off him. You stop now, you die, Caitlin. He wasn't joking. The raw menace in his voice grounded her. I'm not stopping. Caitlin whispered. She gripped the 9th dial. She applied pressure. The metal resisted. It felt like hitting a solid brick wall. Panic flared in her chest. Had she misaligned the 4th pin? Had she triggered a secondary lock? She pushed harder. Nothing. Listen to the metal, her father said. Caitlin let go of the dial. She took a step back, opening her eyes. Damien's jaw tightened. Did you break it? No, Caitlin said. She stared at the cylinder. The 9th dial wasn't meant to be turned. It was a pressure plate. The entire casing was the final key. She stepped forward, placed both hands on the outer edges of the cylinder, and pushed the entire chassis inward, compressing the metal like an accordion. A sharp, violent crack echoed through the room. Ledger cursed and took a step back, shielding his face, expecting a spray of deadly acid. Damien didn't flinch. The titanium cylinder hissed, releasing a puff of pressurized air. Slowly, the heavy metal casing slid apart, revealing a velvet-lined interior. Resting safely on the velvet was a small, matte black USB drive. Caitlin let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for a year. Her knees buckled slightly, but she caught herself on the edge of the table. She looked up at Damien. Damien stared at the open vault. The impossible puzzle. The bane of his existence for the last month, cracked open by a girl in a cheap uniform in under 4 minutes. He looked at the drive, and then he looked at Caitlin. The atmosphere in the room fundamentally shifted. Before she was a curiosity, an annoyance. Now she was an anomaly. She had just outsmarted the ghost of a Mafia don and 3 engineering prodigies. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Damien's face. It wasn't a smile of gratitude. It was the smile of a man who had just found a very sharp, very valuable weapon. "Well," Damien said softly. He reached out and picked up the drive, rolling it between his thumb and forefinger. "I'll be damned." Caitlin stood up straight. Her heart was still racing, but the desperation anchored her. "I opened it." "You did?" Damien agreed. "You said you'd give the money to whoever fixed it." Caitlin swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "I want my $100 million.
Chat.
Ledger barked a laugh.
End this
loud
stream.
and
Nobody
harsh.
came through.
"Kid, you better grab your mop and run before I throw you off the balcony."
So,
"You really think—" "Shut up, Ledger," Damien said.
looking like a
Damien walked around the table, closing the distance
Peace.
between himself and Caitlin. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and radiated a quiet, terrifying authority. He stopped mere inches from her. Caitlin forced herself not to step back. He looked down at her, his dark eyes stripping away her defenses, analyzing every micro-expression on her face. "You think this is a transaction, Caitlin?" Damien asked, his voice a smooth, deadly purr. "You think you just punch a clock, solve a puzzle, and walk out of here with $100 million in cartel money?" "A deal is a deal," Caitlin whispered. Damien laughed. It was a genuine sound, rich and dark. "You don't want this money, Caitlin. You take this drive and you'll be dead before you reach the lobby. The people who want this ledger don't ask nicely. They don't play games." He stepped closer, leaning in so his mouth was near her ear. She smelled expensive cologne and danger. "But you proved something tonight," Damien murmured. "You proved you see things other people don't." He pulled back, holding her gaze. "I'm not giving you $100 million to walk away." Caitlin's stomach plummeted. "You lied." "No," Damien said,
Oh my God.
slipping the drive into his pocket. "I'm investing. You're not going back to cleaning floors, Caitlin. You just earned yourself a new job." Caitlin stared at him, the reality of what she had just done crashing over her. She hadn't bought her freedom. She had just walked out of one cage and locked herself inside a much more dangerous one. "What if I say no?" she asked. Damien smiled, and this time it was utterly cold. "You won't." The service elevator was no longer an option. Caitlin stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse guest suite, watching the city lights bleed into the heavy, overcast night. The room behind her was a masterpiece of minimalist luxury. Silk sheets, heated floors, a walk-in closet filled with neutral-toned designer clothes that still had the tags on. It was beautiful. It was a cell. 2 hours had passed since she cracked the titanium cylinder. Damien hadn't let her return to the basement locker room to change out of her uniform. Instead, Ledger had escorted her down a long, art-lined hallway, pointed to a heavy oak door, and told her to wash the blood off her hands. The click of the lock engaging behind her had sounded remarkably like a judge's gavel. The door opened without a knock. Caitlin didn't flinch. She turned slowly from the window. Damien Mercer stood in the doorway, having shed his suit jacket. He held a thin manila folder in his left hand. "Your mother," Damien said, stepping into the room and tossing the folder onto the foot of the king-sized bed. "Aspiratory pneumonia. Untreated for 3 weeks. She collapsed in the staff quarters an hour ago." Caitlin's lungs seized. The calm facade she had meticulously built over the last 2 hours shattered. She lunged forward, her hands curling into fists. "Where is she? What did you do?" I put her in a private ambulance. Damien replied, smoothly, unfazed by her sudden movement.
Right when we get a game
He didn't
going,
step
bro.
back. She's currently at Mount
this
Sinai
game going.
receiving broad-spectrum IV
After that,
antibiotics in a VIP suite
street.
that costs $4,000 a night. The leading pulmonologist in the state is missing his daughter's piano recital to monitor her oxygen levels. Caitlin stopped halfway across the room. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a cold, sickening realization. She looked at the folder on the bed. "Open it," he commanded quietly. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the file. Inside were medical receipts stamped and paid in full. There was also a cashier's check made out to her landlord, covering 6 months of back rent and late fees. Finally, at the very back was a printout of a bank wire transfer. $100,000 deposited into an account under Caitlin's name that she hadn't even known existed. "That's a fraction of what you promised," Caitlin said, her voice tight, hollow. "That's a signing bonus," Damien corrected. He walked over to the wet bar in the corner of the room, pouring himself a glass of mineral water. $100 million makes you a target, Caitlin. You wouldn't survive the week. Your mother would be ransomed by Friday. You think you want that kind of money, but you don't. You want security. I just bought your mother's life. I bought your debt. He turned to face her, taking a slow sip of his water. "In exchange, you belong to me." Caitlin stared at the documents. The red ink of her eviction noticed the crushing weight of the pharmacy bills. It was all gone, wiped away by a few keystrokes from a man who treated human lives like line items on a spreadsheet. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt entirely consumed. "I'm a clockmaker's daughter," Caitlin said, bitterly, dropping the folder back onto the bed. "I fix springs and gears. I don't know how to launder money. I don't know how to run drugs or whatever it is you actually do behind that shipping company. I have accountants for the money. I have ledger for the violence," Damien said. He set the glass down and closed the distance between them. He stopped just out of arm's reach. The sheer physical presence of the man was suffocating. "My world is full of locks, Caitlin. Physical, digital, psychological. People hide things from me. Rivals set traps. My father left me an empire rigged with tripwires because he trusted no one, least of all his own blood." Damien leaned in slightly. His dark eyes were utterly devoid of warmth, yet burned with intense, sharp focus. "You see the wires," he murmured. "You bypassed a magnetic deadfall by feeling the tension in titanium. You didn't just pick a lock, you read the mind of the man who built it. That is a very rare, very dangerous kind of empathy. So I'm your master key." Caitlin deadpanned, fighting to keep her voice steady. "You're my insurance policy," Damien replied. He reached out his knuckles, brushing lightly against the cheap cotton of her maid's uniform. The touch was brief, completely devoid of intimacy, yet entirely possessive. "Take a shower. Throw that uniform in the trash. Put on something warm from the closet. We have a pickup at the docks in an hour, and it's raining." He turned and walked toward the door. "What if I refuse?" Caitlin asked to his back. It was a stupid question, but she needed to hear the boundary. Damien paused in the doorway. He didn't look back. "Your mother's doctor is on my payroll, Caitlin. The machine's keeping her breathing plug into my walls. Don't ask questions you already know the answer to." The heavy oak door clicked shut. Pier 44 smelled of diesel exhaust, dead fish, and oxidized iron. The rain came down in cold, diagonal sheets, driven by a biting wind coming off the Atlantic. Caitlin shivered inside the oversized wool coat she had pulled from the penthouse closet. Her boots splashed in shallow puddles of oily water as she walked a half-step behind Damien. Ledger and 3 other men built like brick walls flanked them, sweeping flashlight beams across the stacks of rusted shipping containers. The docks were supposed to be deserted at 3 a.m. They weren't. Ahead, cordoned off by a ring of Damien's heavily armed men, was a standard 40-foot corrugated steel shipping container. The heavy doors were slightly ajar. The Korsakov Syndicate, Damien said, his voice easily cutting through the sound of the driving rain. He didn't look at Caitlin, his eyes fixed on the container. They've been trying to tax my inbound freight. Tonight, one of my dock foremen found this container manifesting under a dummy corporation. He opened the latch. Then he heard the hiss. Damien stopped 20 feet from the steel box. He gestured toward the gap in the doors. The foreman ran. Smart man. But whatever is in there is still active. My usual sweepers won't touch it. They say it's a customized pneumatic trigger. If we pull the doors open, whatever is inside detonates. Caitlin looked from Damien to the dark, gaping sliver of the container. And you brought me here to disarm it. I brought you here to see if the penthouse was a fluke. Damien corrected coldly. If it's a bomb, it blows up half my pier. If it's chemical, it ruins millions in cargo sitting in the adjacent holds. Fix it. Ledger stepped forward, rainwater dripping from the brim of his hat. Boss, this is insane. We can just drag the whole box out to sea and sink it. Why are we trusting a Maid with a bomb? Because the Korsakovs don't leave bombs. Ledger. Damien said, his jaw tightening. They leave messages. I want to know what's in the box. He looked down at Caitlin. Go. Caitlin swallowed the lump of pure terror forming in her throat. She pulled a heavy flashlight from one of the guards and walked toward the container. The rain plastered her dark hair to her face. The closer she got, the more the smell of diesel gave way to something sharper, something metallic and caustic. She slipped through the narrow 8-inch gap between the heavy steel doors. It was pitch black inside. She clicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the damp air, revealing stacks of wooden crates stamped with Cyrillic warnings. But that wasn't what caught her attention. Bolted to the inside of the right door, connecting the heavy steel latch to a pressurized canister, the size of a fire extinguisher, was a mess of copper tubing and pressure valves. Caitlin exhaled slowly. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind instantly quieted. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She traced the copper lines with her eyes. It's a dead man's switch in reverse, she thought. The foreman had unlatched the door, releasing the initial tension. The hiss he heard was the primary air bladder inflating. Now the only thing keeping the firing pin from striking the canister was the friction of the slightly ajar door. If someone pulled the door open, the bladder would expand, fully driving the pin. If someone pushed the door shut, it would crush the glass, housing the secondary trigger. Caitlin crouched down. She shined the light on the canister. White phosphorus. Not a concussive explosive. An incendiary. Designed to burn at 5,000 degrees, melting steel flesh, and whatever evidence was in those wooden crates. What is it? Damien's voice drifted in from the rain, muffled by the steel walls. Phosphorus, Caitlin called back. Her voice echoed slightly in the cramped space. Pneumatic trigger. You pull the door, we all burn. Can you stop it? Caitlin stared at the mechanism. It was crude compared to the titanium cylinder. It was brutal and ugly, but it relied on the exact same principles, tension and release. The builder expected a bomb squad to try and freeze the mechanism or cut the copper lines. Cutting the line would drop the pressure, releasing the pin. She didn't need to cut the line. She needed to trick the pressure valve. I need a heavy wrench, Caitlin yelled out. And a roll of industrial duct tape, quickly. A minute later, a large, heavy pipe wrench and a roll of silver tape were shoved through the gap in the door. Caitlin set the flashlight on a crate, pointing it at the mechanism. She grabbed the wrench. She didn't go for the delicate copper tubing. She looked at the heavy steel bracket holding the pressurized air bladder to the door frame. She wedged the teeth of the pipe wrench behind the bracket. She didn't pry it. She just applied exactly enough leverage to mimic the pressure of a fully closed door, pushing the bracket tight against the metal. Okay, Caitlin muttered to herself. Hold the tension. With one hand maintaining a death grip on the heavy iron wrench, She used her teeth to tear off strips of the duct tape. She wrapped the tape violently around the handle of the wrench and the steel latch bar of the door, binding them together. She pulled the tape so tight her fingers cramped, wrapping it 12 times until it formed a thick, immovable cast. She slowly let go of the wrench. The tape held. The wrench kept the steel bracket pinned. The pressure valve didn't move. Caitlin let out a shuddering breath. She picked up her flashlight, her legs shaking so badly she almost tripped over a pallet. She squeezed back through the narrow gap in the doors and stumbled out into the freezing rain. She nearly collapsed, but a strong hand clamped onto her upper arm, steadying her. Damien held her upright. His grip was entirely unyielding. "It's neutralized!" Caitlin gasped, wiping the rainwater from her eyes. "The firing pin is locked by the wrench. You can open the doors, but you have to unbolt the entire latch mechanism from the outside first. Don't touch the copper wires." Ledger stared at her, then looked at his men. "Get the drill. Unbolt the damn latch." Damien didn't look at the container. He was looking at Caitlin. She was soaked to the bone, shivering violently, her face pale and streaked with grease. She looked fragile enough to snap in the wind, but the fire in her eyes, the sheer, stubborn refusal to die, was blinding. "You didn't cut the wire," Damien observed quietly. "Builders lie." Caitlin said, her breathing heavy. "Wires are traps. I changed the environment so the machine thought the door was closed. It's basic mechanics." Damien let go of her arm. A slow, terrifying realization dawned in his chest. He hadn't just bought a mechanic. He had found someone who understood the architecture of violence better than the men who committed it. "Ledger," Damien called out, his eyes never leaving Caitlin. "When you open that box, inventory the Korsakov's shipment. Then burn the phosphorus anyway. Let them know we opened their mail." He unbuttoned his own heavy cashmere overcoat and draped it over Caitlin's trembling shoulders. It was heavy, retaining his body heat, and smelled of his cologne. It was a gesture of protection, but it felt like a heavy chain settling around her neck. "You did well, Caitlin," Damien said, his voice dropping to a low rumble that barely carried over the rain. "Welcome to the family." 3 days passed in a blur of clinical isolation. Damien relocated Caitlin to a subterranean workshop, 2 floors beneath his primary compound in the financial district. The room was a sterile contrast to the chaotic, grease-stained workbench she used to share with her father in their tiny apartment. Here the walls were lined with pegboards holding German-engineered titanium tools, sonic cleaners, and digital calipers that cost more than her mother's annual salary. It was a mechanic's paradise. It was also a bunker. There were no windows, and the steel door locked from the outside. Caitlin sat hunched over a heavy steel table, a jeweler's loop pressed to her right eye. Under the harsh glare of a halogen ring light, she was dissecting the firing mechanism of a customized Glock 19. Ledger had dropped it on a desk an hour ago with a simple grunt and a demand to figure out why it jammed on one of our boys in a firefight. She nudged a microscopic fleck of deformed metal out of the firing pin channel with a fine-tipped dental pick. "The extractor spring is custom," Caitlin said aloud, not looking up. Ledger, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, raised an eyebrow. He had been watching her work for 20 minutes in complete silence. He didn't trust her. To Ledger, trust was something earned in blood, not by playing with puzzles. "So," Ledger grunted, "so whoever modified this weapon didn't account for the tensile strength of the factory casing?" Caitlin explained flatly. She set the pick down and pulled the loop from her eye, turning to face him. They put a heavier spring in to increase the ejection rate, but it caused the extractor to bite too hard into the brass. It ripped the rim off the cartridge and left the casing stuck in the chamber. "It's a stupid amateur mistake. Your guy is lucky the gun didn't detonate in his hand." Ledger scowled, pushing off the doorframe. He walked over to the desk, snatching the disassembled pieces of the handgun. I'll let the armorer know he's an idiot. You don't need to tell him. He knows, Caitlin said. Ledger paused. What's that supposed to mean? I mean, a professional armorer doesn't make that mistake accidentally. It's a sabotage technique. Caitlin replied, her voice remaining carefully neutral. She pointed to a tiny, almost invisible scratch mark on the inside of the slide. That's a guide mark. Someone deliberately filed the sear angle to ensure a failure after a specific amount of heat buildup. This gun was meant to jam during sustained fire. Silence stretched between them. Ledger's face hardened, the cynical disdain melting into something incredibly dangerous. The implication hung heavy in the air. There was a rat in their armory. Before Ledger could interrogate her further, the heavy steel door hummed and unsealed. Damien walked in. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit looking completely out of place in the industrial workshop, yet entirely in command of it. He carried two things, a steaming cup of coffee and a thick manila envelope. Ledger. Damien said a clear dismissal. Ledger looked from Caitlin to the dismantled gun in his hands. He gave a short, rigid nod to Damien. We have a problem in the logistics division. I need to make a phone call. He turned on his heel and marched out the heavy door sliding shut behind him. Damien set the coffee on Caitlin's desk. Black, 2 sugars. I assumed you needed it. Thank you, Caitlin said softly, wrapping her cold hands around the cardboard cup. She didn't drink. She just held it, absorbing the warmth. How is she? Your mother is sitting up, Damien said, pulling out a steel stool and sitting across from her. The pneumonia is clearing. Dr. Evans expects to take her off the supplemental oxygen by tomorrow morning. Caitlin closed her eyes, a shuddering breath escaping her lips. The crushing vice around her chest loosened just a fraction. Can I call her? No, Damien answered instantly. It wasn't cruel, it was factual. If she hears your voice, she'll know something is wrong. The official story is that you were offered a highly lucrative overseas contracting job. She believes you are currently on a rig in the North Sea. It keeps her safe. It keeps you focused.
Chat.
Caitlin
Ending stream, nobody came
his
through.
Dark, unreadable stare. She hated the logic of it.
So,
She hated that he was right. Speaking of focus,
it's looking like a dub.
Damien continued tossing the manila
Peace.
envelope onto her desk. Calvin strikes back. He wasn't happy about us burning his phosphorus shipment at the docks. She unwound the red string and tipped the contents onto the stainless steel table. It was a heavy, ornate brass pocket watch. It looked incredibly old, the metal tarnished and scratched. Attached to the chain was a handwritten note on expensive stationery. Time is running out, Mercer. Let's talk. See, he wants a sit down, Damien said, leaning forward, his forearms resting on his knees. Tonight, at the Continental Dining Club, neutral ground. Caitlin picked up the watch. It was a beautiful piece of engineering. She could hear the faint, rapid ticking of the internal escapement mechanism. Why are you showing me this? It's a threat, not a puzzle. Because it belonged to my grandfather, Damien said softly. Caitlin froze. She looked up at him. The dangerous, detached Mafia boss was gone for a split second, replaced by a man staring at a ghost. Calvin's men hit one of my safe houses last night, Damien explained, his voice chillingly calm. They didn't kill anyone. They just cracked a floor safe and took this.
Oh my god.
Then they sent it to me an hour ago to demand a meeting. It's a power play, Caitlin noted. It's a trap, Damien corrected. Calvin doesn't do theatrics unless he's covering a sleight of hand. He wants me to bring the watch to the meeting. He wants me to hand it back to him or put it on the table as a concession. Caitlin pressed the watch to her ear. She listened past the ticking. She closed her eyes, letting the mechanical rhythm paint a picture in her mind. The balance wheel was oscillating perfectly. The mainspring was releasing kinetic energy at a steady, measured rate, but there was a drag. a secondary vibration beneath the brass casing. "It's heavy," Caitlin murmured. "It's brass. It's supposed to be heavy." "No," Caitlin insisted, opening her eyes. She grabbed a specialized case knife from her tool rack. "The center of gravity is off. The weight is pulling to the left side of the casing. Mechanical watches are perfectly balanced." Damien watched her, his expression tightening. "Open it." Caitlin slipped the thin blade into the microscopic seal at the back of the watch. She didn't pry. She twisted slightly, breaking the vacuum seal. The brass backplate popped off with a sharp click. She stared at the internal workings. The antique gears were beautiful, catching the light. But nestled directly against the inner wall of the casing, wired straight into the winding stem, was a flat, matte black receiver, no larger than a postage stamp, connected to a microcapsule of highly compressed gas. "It's not an explosive," Caitlin whispered, grabbing a pair of ceramic non-conductive tweezers. "It's a nerve agent. The winding stem is rigged as a remote detonator. When you turn the crown to set the time, it snaps a microscopic pin piercing the gas capsule." Damien didn't flinch, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Calvin expects me to check the time during the sit-down. Or he just wanted to ensure you died holding a family heirloom," Caitlin said.
Let's get this game going.
Her hands were perfectly steady
After that,
as she used the tweezers to carefully
that's true.
extract the tiny capsule, placing it gently into a heavy, lead-lined waste container. She severed the receiver wires with a pair of snips. The watch kept ticking, entirely oblivious to the lethal hardware that had just been removed from its guts. Caitlin set the watch down on the table and looked at Damien. Damien stared at the disarmed trap, and then he looked at the girl in the oversized sweater sitting across from him. She had just saved his life. Again. He stood up slowly, picking up the brass pocket watch. He slipped it into his suit pocket. "Get dressed, Caitlin," Damien ordered quietly. "You're coming to dinner." The Continental Dining Club smelled of aged oak expensive cigars and old money. It was the kind of place where wars were started over a mispronounced vintage of wine. Caitlin sat rigidly in a high-backed leather chair, staring at the pristine white tablecloth. She wore a sleek black evening dress that Damien had arranged for her. It fit perfectly, completely, stripping away the invisible armor of her old cotton maid's uniform. She felt exposed. She felt like prey. Damien sat beside her, radiating a terrifying, relaxed confidence. Ledger stood near the heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room, arms crossed, eyes tracking every shadow. Across the table sat Calvin. Calvin didn't look like a mobster. He looked like a hedge fund manager. He wore a navy bespoke suit, his blonde hair perfectly styled, and a diamond-studded Rolex gleaming on his left wrist. But his eyes were dead flat and completely devoid of empathy. Two massive men in trench coats flanked his chair. "Damien." Calvin smiled, leaning back and resting his hands on his stomach. "I appreciate you accommodating the short notice, and I see you brought company." Calvin's eyes slid to Caitlin, dragging over her with a predatory, dismissive appraisal. "Caitlin is a consultant," Damien said smoothly, taking a slow sip of his bourbon. "She advises me on high-value acquisitions." "A consultant," Calvin chuckled, waving a hand dismissively. "How progressive of you. I prefer to keep my business in-house. Speaking of which, I assume you received my invitation." "I did," Damien replied. He reached into his suit jacket. Calvin's posture stiffened microscopically. The two men behind him shifted their weight. Damien pulled out the brass pocket watch and placed it gently in the center of the table. The dull metal caught the dim light of the crystal chandelier. Calvin's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. A beautiful piece. Tragic that it was misplaced during that misunderstanding at your property. Misunderstandings happen. Damien said, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. "I brought it back, Calvin, because I want to make sure we're operating on the same timeline moving forward." "I entirely agree," Calvin purred. He leaned forward, gesturing to the watch. "In fact, I think we should sync our schedules right now. Why don't you check the time on that lovely antique, Damien? Tell me how much time we have left to negotiate before I decide to take the docks by force." It was a direct challenge, a command. Caitlin's heart hammered against her ribs. Underneath the table, her hands gripped the fabric of her dress so hard, her knuckles ached. Calvin was waiting for Damien to turn the crown. He was waiting for the nerve agent to deploy. He had likely taken an antidote beforehand, or planned to simply hold his breath and walk out of the room while Damien choked to death on his own blood. Damien didn't reach for the watch. Instead, he glanced at Caitlin. "Caitlin!" Damien said softly. "What time is it?" Calvin frowned, his eyes darting between the two of them. "Don't outsource this, Damien. It's your family's watch. You set the time." Caitlin reached out. Her hand was steady. She picked up the heavy brass watch. She felt Calvin's eyes burning into her skin. She didn't look at him. She looked at the winding stem. "The time is entirely irrelevant, Calvin," Caitlin said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the heavy silence of the room like a scalpel. She gripped the winding crown. Calvin's eyes widened. He half stood from his chair, a sudden panic breaking through his polished veneer. "Wait!" Caitlin twisted the crown hard. A sharp metallic click echoed in the quiet room. Nothing happened. No hiss of gas. No lethal cloud. Just the steady rhythmic ticking of the antique escapement wheel. Calvin froze. He stared at the watch in Caitlin's hand, his mind violently struggling to process the failure of his trap. He looked up at Damien, the realization dawning on him. Damien smiled. It was a terrifying, cold expression. "Like my consultant said," Damien whispered, leaning over the table. "The time is irrelevant, because your time is already up." Before Calvin could move, before his guards could even reach into their trench coats, the room exploded into motion. Ledger was a blur of violence. He crossed the distance in two massive strides, drawing a suppressed pistol from his shoulder holster. Two muffled thwips sounded in rapid succession. Calvin's guards dropped to the carpet like cut puppets, entirely neutralized before they could draw their weapons. Calvin stumbled backward, his chair crashing to the floor. He tried to scramble towards the door, his face pale with raw, unfiltered terror. Damien didn't run. He simply stood up, drew his own weapon, and fired once. Calvin collapsed against the mahogany wall, clutching his right kneecap, screaming in agony. The silence rushed back into the room, broken only by Calvin's ragged, pathetic sobbing. Caitlin sat completely still. The smell of copper and cordite filled the air, cutting through the expensive cigars and roasted duck. Her ears rang. She had grown up fixing clocks. She had spent the last 3 days disarming bombs. But this was the first time she had witnessed the brutal, unvarnished reality of Damien Mercer's world. She slowly set the brass watch back down on the table. It kept ticking. Damien walked around the table, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He stood over Calvin, looking down at the bleeding man with absolute disgust. "You brought a toy to a gunfight, Calvin," Damien said softly. He turned back to the table and looked at Caitlin. She was pale, her breathing shallow, but she hadn't screamed. She hadn't run. She sat in the wreckage of the violence, the architect who had dismantled the enemy's masterstroke. Damien holstered his weapon. He walked over, pulled her chair out, and offered her his hand. "Dinner is over," he said. Caitlin looked at his hand. It was the hand that had just shattered a man's leg. It was the hand that was paying for her mother's life. She took it. The armored SUV smelled of rain-expensive leather and the faint, acrid lingering of cordite. Caitlin sat in the back seat, staring out the tinted window at the blurred, neon-streaked streets of the city. The heavy glass separated her from the world she used to inhabit. A world of eviction notices, late-night buses, and the invisible exhaustion of the working poor. Tonight she had watched a man get shot. She had held the trigger to a nerve agent and didn't blink. The girl who scrubbed floors felt like a distant, naive stranger. Damien sat beside her. He had poured 2 fingers of scotch from the vehicle's crystal decanter, offering her the glass. Caitlin took it. The liquor burned a fiery path down her throat, settling in her stomach, and finally cutting through the icy shock in her veins. She let her head rest against the leather seat, closing her eyes. "You didn't look away," Damien said quietly. Caitlin opened her eyes, turning her head to face him in the dim interior light. He was watching her with that same intense, analytical focus he used when disassembling an enemy's territory. But the cold detachment was gone. There was a raw, dangerous proximity between them now. "Would it have mattered if I did?" Caitlin asked, her voice raspy from the scotch. "Most people do. They want the money, they want the safety, but they want the violence to happen off-screen." Damien replied, resting his forearms on his knees. "Calvin will live. He'll walk with a cane for the rest of his miserable life, and he will never step foot on my docks again. That is the physics of my world, Caitlin. Action and absolute reaction." Caitlin stared at the ice melting in her glass. "And what about me? Am I an action or a reaction?" Damien reached out, taking the heavy crystal glass from her trembling fingers and setting it on the center console. He didn't pull his hand back. He let his knuckles brush against the soft fabric of her black dress, his fingers wrapping gently around her wrist. He could feel her pulse racing. "You are the anomaly," Damien murmured. He leaned closer. The physical space between them vanished, filled entirely by the gravity of his presence. "My father taught me that everyone has a price, and everyone has a tell," Damien said, his voice dropping to a low, hypnotic register. "He built a criminal empire by finding the weakness in the foundation and applying pressure until the structure collapsed. I've spent my entire life looking for the cracks in people. Did you find mine?" Caitlin challenged, refusing to look away, even as her breath caught in her throat. "I found your mother's illness. I found your debt." Damien acknowledged, his thumb slowly tracing the frantic pulse at her wrist. "I thought I bought a tool, but you don't just see the cracks, Caitlin. You see how to reinforce them. You fix things. You fixed my father's vault. You fixed Calvin's trap. And tonight, you didn't just survive my world, you outsmarted it." Caitlin felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks, entirely unrelated to the scotch. The way he looked at her was terrifying. It wasn't the gaze of a captor anymore. It was the gaze of a man who had been operating in the dark his entire life and had finally found someone who could navigate by the exact same non-existent light. "I didn't ask for this," Caitlin whispered, pulling her wrist back slightly. Damien let her go, respecting the boundary, though his eyes never left hers. "No, you asked for $100 million. You asked for survival." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, flat electronic keycard. It was solid black, bearing only a small gold crest. He held it out to her. "What is this?" Caitlin asked, staring at the plastic. "It's an unrestricted pass," Damien explained. "It opens the front doors of the compound. It accesses the private elevator. It bypasses the perimeter gates. If you swipe this, the guards stand down. The lockdown lifts." Caitlin's heart skipped a beat. She looked from the card to his face. "You're letting me go. I'm giving you the ability to leave," Damien corrected softly. Dr. Evans moved your mother to a private rehabilitation facility upstate this afternoon. It's fully funded. She is safe. Her debt is erased. If you take this card, you can walk out of my compound tonight and disappear. You can go back to being invisible. Caitlin reached out her fingers, hovering over the black card. It was everything she had wanted 3 days ago. Freedom, safety, a clean slate. But as she looked at the key, the thought of returning to her tiny, damp apartment felt suffocating. The thought of blending into the background of being furniture while men like Calvin preyed on the weak made her stomach churn. She looked at Damien. He had built a fortress around himself, rigged with traps, trusting absolutely no one. And yet here he was, handing her the master key to his cage. "Why are you giving me this?" Caitlin asked, her voice trembling slightly. Damien's jaw tightened. "Because a lock only works if the person inside wants to stay. If I force you to remain, you'll eventually figure out how to break me, just like you broke everything else. I don't want a hostage, Caitlin." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy in the suffocating air of the SUV. He wanted a partner. Caitlin slowly lowered her hand. She didn't take the card. "Keep it," Caitlin said, her voice steadying, finding a new solid anchor in the chaos. "I have work to do in the armory tomorrow. The firing pins on the new shipments need recalibrating." A flicker of raw, unrestrained emotion crossed Damien's face. Relief, dangerous pride, and something entirely possessive. He slowly slipped the card back into his pocket. "Recalibrating." Damien repeated, a dark, genuine smile touching his lips. "Yes," Caitlin said. She reached out this time, initiating the contact, and rested her hand over his. His skin was warm, his hands heavily scarred from years of violence, but they were entirely steady beneath her touch. "Builders lied, Damien. If we're going to survive what comes next, we have to rebuild the foundation." Damien turned his hand over, intertwining his fingers with hers. The grip was firm, an unspoken vow sealed in the back of an armored car. "Then we rebuild it," he promised. 6 months later, the penthouse was quiet, but it was no longer a tomb. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. The massive mahogany conference table where Aris the engineer had once sweat through his suit was now littered with schematics, disassembled hydraulic valves, and 2 empty mugs of black coffee. Caitlin stood by the window, wearing a tailored charcoal blazer over a simple white blouse. She was looking down at the sprawling city below. She wasn't invisible anymore. The men on the docks knew her name. The armorers feared her inspections. Ledger, who once threatened to throw her off a balcony, now refused to authorize a security protocol without her direct sign-off. She had become the architect of the Mercer Syndicate's defenses. Footsteps sounded on the hardwood floor. Caitlin didn't turn around. She knew the cadence of his walk, the heavy, measured rhythm of a man who owned the ground he stood on. Damien wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his breathing slow and steady. "Ledger says the Korsakovs agreed to the new shipping lanes." Damien murmured, his voice a low vibration against her back. "They didn't even try to negotiate. They know if they push our remotely lock their freight containers in transit." Caitlin said, leaning back into his embrace. "It's amazing how agreeable people become when you control their oxygen."
Peace.
Damien chuckled, a dark, rich sound. He pressed a kiss to the side of her neck, his lips warm against her skin. "You are terrifying, Caitlin." "I learned from the best," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. He looked down at her. The exhaustion that used to haunt his eyes was gone, replaced by a sharp, lethal clarity. They operated in a world built on blood and extortion, But inside this penthouse, they had forged a sanctuary built on absolute, unshakable trust. It wasn't a traditional romance, it was a partnership of predators. Damien reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. He placed it in the palm of her hand. Caitlin looked down. It was the titanium cylinder, the puzzle box that had started it all. It's empty, Caitlin noted, looking up at him in confusion. The $100 million crypto drive had been extracted and laundered through their shell companies months ago. It was empty, Damien corrected gently. I had a machinist alter the internal baffling. I changed the sequence. Caitlin's eyes narrowed, a brilliant spark of competitive fire igniting in her chest. She looked down at the brutalist metal casing.
Oh my God.
She traced the Cyrillic dials with her thumb. You built a lock, Caitlin said softly, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. I built a question, Damien said, stepping back slightly to give her room. He crossed his arms over his chest, watching her with that same dangerous pride. I want to see how long it takes you to answer it. Caitlin didn't hesitate. She didn't close her eyes this time. She didn't need to block out the world because the world she was standing in was hers. She gripped the first two dials. She felt the heavy, sluggish resistance of the newly installed magnets. She applied opposing torque, listening to the microscopic vibrations of the titanium. Click. The first pin dropped. Damien watched her hands move over the metal swift and entirely confident. He had inherited an empire rigged with traps, a legacy of paranoia and death. But as he watched Caitlin conquer his puzzle, he knew the old man's curse was finally broken. Money makes people stupid, but finding the one person in the world who holds the key to your absolute ruin and trusting them with it anyway, that makes you untouchable. Caitlin twisted the final dial and pushed the chassis inward. The heavy metal casing hissed and slid apart. Resting on the velvet interior wasn't a flash drive. It was a ring, a flawless emerald-cut diamond set in a heavy band of raw, unpolished titanium. It was beautiful, brutal, and utterly indestructible. Caitlin stopped breathing. She stared at the ring, the mechanical logic of her brain short-circuiting against the overwhelming surge of emotion in her chest. She looked up at Damien. He didn't drop to one knee. That wasn't who they were. He stood tall, holding her gaze with a fierce, unwavering intensity. No more contracts, Damien said, his voice a quiet vow that filled the entire room. No more clauses or escape routes. I don't want a master key, Caitlin. I want you! Caitlin reached into the cylinder and picked up the ring. The metal was cold, but as she slipped it onto her finger, it immediately began to warm against her skin. It fit perfectly. She stepped forward, grabbing the lapels of his suit, and pulled him down to her. The kiss was like a collision, fierce, demanding, and entirely consuming. It was the ceiling of a vault. When they finally broke apart, Caitlin rested her forehead against his. Her breathing ragged, a brilliant, cynical smile lighting up her face. Fix this and I'll give you $100 million. Caitlin whispered, mocking his initial challenge from all those months ago. Damien smiled, his hand sliding down to rest securely on her hips. You already fixed it, he said. The rest is just interest. The truth is, surviving the impossible puzzle was the easy part for Caitlin. Surviving the man who owned it would require entirely new rules. If you're hooked on this high-stakes game of intellect power and dangerous chemistry, you won't want to miss what happens next. Smash that like button, share this story with anyone who loves a brilliant underdog, and subscribe to the channel so you're the first to know when Part 4 drops. The real game has just begun.